In our gospel lesson for this weekend, we see Jesus in Jerusalem for the festival of the dedication. We see him walking in the temple, in a particular place of the temple called the Portico of Solomon. And while walking in the Portico of Solomon, people are directly asking him, "Are you the Messiah?" So I want to tell you a story, and it's a story that you might find familiar. So about 180 years prior to Jesus' being born, Jerusalem, Israel, was occupied by the Greek Seleucids. The Seleucids were ruled over by a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus was his given name. Epiphanes was the name he chose for himself. It literally means manifestation of God. He gave himself the nickname, Manifestation of God. So he thought kind of highly of himself, and he and the Greek Seleucids did everything they could to undermine Jewish culture, way of life, and religion. They did this in sort of innocuous ways, small ways. They would set up little shrines. They set up Greek-style schools. They would tell parents, "You send your kid to our school, and they'll do better, and they'll be worldly, and they'll get into more prestigious colleges." They set up Greek-style gymnasiums or gymnasiums where Greek sport was taught and played, which sounds innocent enough, but the Greeks did sport in the nude. In fact, gymnus, which is where we get the word gym or gymnasium from, literally means naked. Think about that the next time you go to the gym. And doing sport like that was completely against the Jewish way of life. And so they did these little ways of and kind of trying to get at the kids with school and with sport to get them out of their own culture and give them this new culture. I mean, and what Antiochus wanted to do is he wanted to make them into Greeks. Greek thought, Greek religion, Greek society and culture. And he might have succeeded. He might have succeeded at completely eroding the Jewish way of life had he not gone too far. And he went too far. And he went too far by doing this. He set up a huge statue, idol, to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. The temple that was for God, he set up a pagan idol, and as big of an idol as you could imagine. He then brought in his own priests who began sacrificing to Zeus on God's altar in the temple. And they began sacrificing pigs, which they didn't do in Athens or other places. That wasn't a thing. They sacrificed pigs on God's altar to Zeus because pigs, of course, are considered in Old Testament law to be unclean animals. And so you can see them doing everything they possibly can to desecrate the temple. And this was the bridge too far. And so there were little uprisings, but the Greek army was perhaps the most powerful in the world at that time. So what are some uprisings in Jerusalem going to do? Well, there was one particular set of uprisings that were led by a Jewish man whose name is Judas Maccabeus. This is not the Judas that we know of who betrayed Jesus. This is 210 years before that. Judas Maccabeus, his name was Judas. His nickname that others gave him was Maccabeus, and Maccabeus means the hammer. That's a good nickname. That's even better than Manifestation of God in my book. So Judas the Hammer got together a group of guerrilla soldiers. They knew they couldn't take the Greek army on the field of battle, and so they would go and they would attack this garrison under the cover of darkness and this other garrison at night. And they would do all these little things to undermine them, and then they were able to defeat them militarily, and they drove the Seleucids out of Jerusalem. That is a miracle in itself, that this little ragtag group of soldiers were able to defeat and push out one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen up to that point is amazing. But even when they were done defeating the Seleucids, they weren't done, because the temple is still a wreck. They went up to the Temple Mount, and the Greek priests had strewn pig guts all through the courts of the temple. And so the soldiers got at cleaning the temple. They cleansed the temple. And while they were cleaning, they did three major things. One is they took down the statue to Zeus, broke it into a million bits, and chucked it away. The second thing, and this is like the important thing, is they had to figure out what to do with the altar, God's altar. It had been the altar at the heart of the temple for at least 500 years. For 500 years, this altar had been in the presence of God in his temple. For 500 years, this had been the altar upon which sacrifices were made for the forgiveness of sins for the entire nation of Israel. It is the most holy object in all of Israel at this point. But it's made of stone. Stone is porous. And so how much of that pig's blood had seeped into the stones? And even more so, how much sort of spiritual decay had seeped into the stones by offerings being made to Zeus on it? And so the priests of the temple, the forces of Judas, they saw this, and they saw this problem that they didn't think they could solve themselves. It's this holy object. It has been desecrated. It is too holy just to throw away. It is too desecrated for us to use. So they sort of punt, and they say, okay, we aren't going to use this altar now, but we're not going to, so they broke it apart, but they said we're not going to throw the stones of the altar away. We're going to keep them on the temple grounds. And they said that when the Messiah came, the Messiah would know what to do with the stones. The Messiah might even have the power to reconstitute, rededicate, reconsecrate the stones, and they could put the altar back together and start using it again if the Messiah comes. And so they stored the stones of the altar in this section of the temple called the Portico of Solomon. The third thing they did to cleanse the temple was they lit the lamps, the oil lamps. There was a great menorah in the temple that stood by the altar. And just like we do when we start church service, we light candles. We get the lights going. When they were going to rededicate the temple, they got the candles lit. But the problem was they only had enough oil to last them one day. But miraculously, amazingly, the lamps stayed lit for 8 days. I mean, this is obviously the story of Hanukkah, right? It's the story of God giving victory in the most unlikely of places at the most unlikely of times. It's the story of God literally shining a light in the darkness, keeping the light going in the darkness. It's the story of the faithfulness of the people of Jerusalem and of Judas. And it's the story that Jesus, 210 years later, went to Jerusalem to commemorate on the Feast of the Dedication, Hanukkah. Jesus is in town for Hanukkah. And when he's in town for Hanukkah, where does he happen to be walking? In the Portico of Solomon. And what are people asking him while he's walking in the Portico of Solomon? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? Are you it? Basically, are you the Messiah? Can you do something with these stones? If Jesus had, on any other day of the year, just been walking through the Portico of Solomon, that might be coincidence. But for Jesus to be walking through the Portico of Solomon during Hanukkah, this is not a coincidence. For him to be asked about whether he's the Messiah in the Portico of Solomon on the Feast of the Dedication, This is not a coincidence. John, as he writes this gospel, knew that his original readers would know the story about the stones being in the portico of Solomon. They would have known the story of Hanukkah. They would have known about people waiting for the Messiah to come to rededicate the stones or to figure out what to do with them. John's original audience would have known exactly what was going on here. But here's the thing. What we might expect Jesus to do would be to rededicate the stones, or at least talk about the stones, or say something about the stones, or use them in a parable, or something, right? He doesn't even in the 10th chapter of John reference the stones. He doesn't rededicate the stones. He does nothing with it. The story goes on. You should know when John writes this gospel, and he writes this story down, some 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, some 70 years after Jesus is walking in the temple courts, when John writes this gospel down, the temple's gone. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans. It's been gone for probably 30 years when John writes this down. There is no temple. There is no porch of Solomon. The stones, who knows where they are? It's gone. So what's going on here? Why does Jesus do this? Why does John write this down like this? And there's probably a million answers. I don't know for sure what's going on here. I don't think anyone really does, but I have an idea. And my idea is this. I think what John is doing here, and I think what Jesus is doing here, is saying, without saying it, that Jesus didn't come to rededicate an altar. He didn't come to say, okay, now this stone is holy and this stone isn't. Or this place is holy and this place isn't. He didn't come for a temple. He didn't come for buildings. He didn't come to set one thing apart from another. Jesus, in his incarnation, God coming among us, is basically saying that it's not just one place in creation is holy. The whole thing is holy. Every place, everywhere, every stone, every square inch on planet Earth is saturated with the presence of God. There's one detail in the Gospels where when Jesus does something, he feeds 5,000 people, he gives a sermon on a mountaintop, he's transfigured, he ascends into heaven, he does these things. The gospel authors never tell us where these things happened. They don't say, and then he ascended Mount such and such and gave a teaching, or he went to such and such field and fed a whole bunch of people. We aren't told where these things happened. In the Old Testament, things are always named. And Moses went to this mountain. He went to Mount Pisgah. He went to Mount Moriah. He went to Mount Tabor. He went to Mount Sinai. But Jesus, when Jesus does things, the gospel authors almost never tell us exactly where it is. Where is he baptized? The River Jordan. But where on the River Jordan? The River Jordan's a long thing. It could have been anywhere, on either bank. It would be like me saying, I'll meet you tomorrow for coffee at the Hudson River. You have no idea where to go. And it seems to be the point of the gospel authors that they didn't want to identify the place that Jesus ascended into heaven. They didn't want to identify the mountaintop that Jesus was transfigured before his disciples. They didn't want to identify the exact place that Jesus fed 5,000 people with a couple loaves of bread and a few fish, because they didn't want us going and revering this spot and that spot and that spot. It's because Jesus is not about coming and making this place holy and that place not holy. Jesus came to tell us the whole thing is blessed. The whole creation is filled with the presence of God. Every stone that you stepped on today, every piece of pavement, every spit of grass, every bit of carpet, wood, stone, whatever it was, is holy. It's holy ground. It's blessed. Every day that we have, whether it's a great day, whether it's a boring day, where all we do is just sit around and play with our phones, or every day that absolutely breaks our heart, every one of those days is saturated with the presence of God wherever we go, whenever we go. We are on holy ground and holy time. And it's in those moments, the good days, the bad days, and the indifferent days, that the perennial story of God is proclaimed. The light shines, even in the darkness.